Just when you thought you'd heard my last take and my last word on the 2023 fantasy football season, here I am with one more just to try and wrap it up in a nice bow. Now, the last few videos I've been focusing more on the fantasy playoffs in each of the leagues, but not necessarily from the NFL perspective. And certainly I haven't been doing kind of a full year thing. So I thought that's what this could serve as a nice little closure to a great year that it's been. Now, for many of you, you know, I also tinker around with other sites and I like to write a few things and do some podcasts occasionally, and I like to link them together. So I was doing that, a podcast that I recorded a long time ago, and I was writing an article just kind of to coincide, and it kind of hit me. I could steal a bit from, I mean, other people do this as well, but the first time I saw this, it was a writer way back in college, used to sometimes wrap up other seasons by comparing them with a movie that you're into or quotes, or you kind of take along and say, you know, this season as it relates to this. And since I was already doing one that was kind of in a similar vein, but not quite, I thought I'd kind of steal it, and then it fell out from there. So this is going to be the fantasy football 2023 season as it relates to characters and quotes from one of my favorite movies, Ocean's 11. If you haven't seen it, it's 20 years old. Go see it. I'm not going to walk you through, but there will probably be spoilers occasionally for a 20-year-old movie. Anyway, here we go. Hope you enjoy. You got to start with the title character, Danny Ocean himself, George Clooney. For this, it's going to be the fantasy MVP. Now, you can argue maybe Clooney wasn't the MVP of the whole bit, but that actually coincides with who I'm picking here. I think, number one, I actually think he's the real NFL MVP, even though he is not currently the odds maker because he's not a quarterback. But I think it's Christian McCaffrey. If you took him, especially if you took him early, around the people you took him around, you are probably insanely happy. There's a lot of people that went early or in auction drafts for a lot of money that ended up being slight disappointments, sometimes because of their play, sometimes because of injuries or injuries on their team. But for the most part, he was there every week. Now, he was number one running back a few times, but he was top 5 almost every week. And I think pretty much like top 8 literally every week, maybe except for one. Now, granted, just as the movie comparison, while everyone is celebrating a robbery well done, Danny Ocean's getting punched in the basement by Bruiser, or pretending to be. Again, I am going to just be acting like everyone has seen this movie. So if you haven't, please watch the movie. It's worth watching. And that kind of coincides because in the fantasy playoffs, he got you to the finals or got you to a good match, but the last couple weeks, he wasn't his best. San Francisco had some off weeks. So that's our fantasy MVP, and that's Danny Ocean. Okay, if you're going to go 1A, you got to go 1B, and in this case, that's Brad Pitt's character in Rusty. Rusty Ryan, I looked up his name. I don't think they ever actually used that in the movie, but there you go, a little trivia for you. For this, it's like the closet MVP, or the most important or most vital. And by that, if you keep watching the movies, they say a few times, if you ever have a problem, he's the one you actually go to, not Danny Ocean. So these are the people that I felt had more closeted value, or could have been late round or waiver wire steals at some point in time. So not only did they weren't necessarily the people you took in the first round, you might not have taken them at all. And not only could they have gotten you to the playoffs, some of these people I'm going to highlight had amazing playoffs. At quarterback, the two that I think stand out is Love and Purdy. Now, Jordan Love especially had some downtime throughout the year, so you'd almost been better to take Purdy for the regular season, but then Love for the playoffs. He was cheap. In some cases, he got dropped. You could pick him up, and his last 4 or 5 weeks were pretty outstanding. He was in the top 5, I think top 2 during the finals, next to Lamar, who you would have had to pay a lot to get. So obviously, I think you see what I'm doing here. Lamar is a more valuable player overall, and did finish slightly higher than these two, but these are two you could get super late in a draft or off the waiver wire. You see what I'm doing? And they did finish. Love was actually quarterback 5 and Purdy 6, although in the playoffs, Love would have been in your top 3 choices. At running back, I think you have a couple, like people like White that I mentioned, that was an RB6 that you could take super late, but by far the steal of the draft on this one, you got to go with the Rams and Williams. He was a waiver wire pickup because everyone thought Akers was going to be the running back at the beginning of the year, and he ends up being the running back too, and that's with not necessarily starting off with all the carries, and certainly that few weeks of injury. So right behind Christian McCaffrey was someone that essentially you could have gotten for free. At wide receiver, we're going to stay with the Rams. He ended up as the wide receiver 6 in most scoring formats. That's Puka Nacua, but he did also have consistency. He had that little lull in between when they were figuring out when Kupp came back and all that, but he would have gotten you through. Weirdly enough, the other two I picked were people that weren't necessarily in our top 12. So someone like Pickens, who I was actually insanely frustrated with. I had him in another league, keeper league nonetheless. He did finish as wide receiver 17, but if you got to the playoffs, he was the wide receiver 6 throughout the the last couple weeks of the season. Richie Rice as well for the Chiefs ended up being the only receiver that could actually catch consistently. That'll come up later. He did finish as the wide receiver 24, but as someone who wasn't even drafted, and then he was actually the 14th ranked in the playoffs. So that doesn't sound amazing, but if he's the guy that you pick up for nothing and ends up being your second or third wide receiver or even a flex, that ended up being pretty valuable for you. For tight end, this one was easy. I mean, you could talk about McBride and Njoku, who finished 8 and 5 respectively. And Njoku you had to draft, but there were some draft boards I saw he got dropped, and McBride you could just pick up. But by far, our tight end one, Sam Laporta, you had to go with that. I mean, with rookie tight ends, you never really know. So most people avoided him in the draft. You could pick him up off the waiver wire, but you had to do it early because I think most people by week 4 or 5 figured it out. And he being even more valuable than Kelsey was outstanding. We'll get to something with that later on. And with defense, actually a surprising one that was not picked up in most leagues. And if I look now, is still available, even though you can't take them. Las Vegas. Now, they ended up not being the sexiest pick throughout the year, if you think about it, but they did end up as the 9th rated defense overall, and they were the number 1 ranked defense for the last 4 weeks of the season, including the playoffs. So they would have gotten you exactly where you needed to go, and weirdly enough, as soon as the coaching change happened, they started pouring it on. So actually, a defensive 9 is misleading. You wouldn't have wanted to start them for the first half, but if you took them at the midway point, they definitely took you where you wanted to go. As that relates to Rusty, if you've seen the movie, he's everywhere and nowhere, right? He's always the check-in point. He's always the person that doesn't always necessarily get the credit. The band isn't named after him, but without him, it all falls apart. So I thought it was an apt comparison. I'm mentioning new characters end quotes. This one is both. So this one's Saul. Now, I'm not doing all of the 11 characters. I could, and I could probably make this be an hour-long video, but I'm not going to. For Saul, if you don't remember, played by Carl Reiner, the old guy, as soon as he gets roped in, because remember, he got religion, not ulcers, or ulcers, not religion, there it is. He starts taking medication and starts the bit, and you actually think he's probably going to keel over at some point in time in this thing, and it's a good bit that they have. But he does kind of let the cat out of the bag with one line when he's asked, if he's ready for this by George Clooney's character, and he throws out that, if you ever ask me that question again, Daniel, you will not wake up the following morning, suggesting that he's ready. And then obviously it is a bit, so it looks like he's near death. He's the character that is in kind of the background. He's watching the vault. He goes down and dies of a cardiac arrest, only to find out it was a bit the whole time, and he's just a method actor that has been playing you the whole time. So for this is our comeback player. I don't think there's any shock on this one. I know in the real NFL, it's likely to go to Hamlin because he pretty much died on the field last year and actually technically did for a small amount of time, came back and has made a couple tackles. But for us in fantasy, it's Joe Flacco. He literally rose from the dead and came out and was now, the last couple weeks, he was the quarterback 2 in most scoring, right? And could have been 1, actually, if Lamar didn't go nuts in the finals. So if you take just the weeks that he started, he was a top 2, top 3 quarterback. And you could get him for nothing. I know this because I picked him up jokingly and then dropped him in one of the leagues. And then the person who won ended up taking him in that league, and he got him where he needed to go. So congratulations, Joe Flacco. And to Saul. Great character. Linus Caldwell is played by Matt Damon's an interesting one. He's not necessarily the most enigmatic, and he certainly changes a lot over the series in a way that I don't know if I always love, but it is what it is. In this one, if you actually remember, one of the biggest things is his introduction is after a scene I will talk about in a minute, but it's a complete shift. Soderbergh likes to play around with a lot of format and genre, so there's a tempo change, the music change, even the filming is done obviously differently. You don't have to be a wannabe film school student to pick it up. And so for me, if I'm going to do not just this character, because it is a little bit of a shift and kind of a background storyline, I went one that just what's a narrative that I talked about, but maybe I didn't even talk about enough. And in this case, I'm going to go with tight ends. The reason being is, and just kind of a side tangent, I didn't want to put this as an award. There will not be a Taylor Swift award on this one. I just thought it was more forced. And Kelsey is not really a story for this season. But I will say, if you're someone who consumes the normal media, if you're as old as I am, you remember when Tony Romo and Jessica Simpson were dating for a bit, and she'd be in the stands or up in the box, and Romo choked it, and they said it's all her fault. Romo choked regardless of who was in the stands. Sorry if anyone's a Dallas fan, but I'm telling the truth. He always chunked it. It was what it was. I think it's kind of ridiculous that we like to blame people in the stands. I get it. It helps their narrative and it doesn't necessarily hurt her. She's more than defended online, but I always think it is hilarious when the cavemen in the sports world kind of go out and start blaming woman in stands make man not think. You're like, I think you would have thought we're beyond that. I mean, there's anyway, but that's a whole other rant for a whole other day. But the tight end rant I wanted to go on, I think the idea here is that some people, myself included in one league, fell into the trap of, in previous years, you took Kelsey, maybe Andrews or a TJ Hawkinson or something like that, or you got nothing because after the top 5, it just cratered, and sometimes even after the top 3. This year was a return to form of the entire position. Now, had Kelsey played in that last game, if it mattered to the Chiefs, he didn't play last night. I'm recording this on the Monday after the playoffs are now set and the league is now done, the regular season. He needed 16 yards to get to 1,000, would have been the 8th consecutive season. So even though he had a disappointing season, he still did fine. Kittle actually did lead in receptions, or sorry, not in receptions, in yards, and did have 1,000. And McBride only needed like 9 yards yesterday to get 7 tight ends that were over 800. TJ Hawkinson would have had another 1,000 as well if he wasn't injured the last couple weeks. So this is a return to form. There was much more options. Your top 10 were pretty tight, and in most leagues, if you don't have more than 10, you can get a good tight end for waiver wire for not kind of spending your first round pick. So sucks for those of us who bit on that Kelsey bandwagon and took him first, but he wasn't necessarily the asset. Not because he was that much worse. It was a down season, but it's just the position got a lot tighter this year. So that's a change of pace I was thinking of. Andy Garcia's Terry Benedict. If you watch the whole series, he does actually have an arc. But in the Ocean's 11, he does not have an arc. He might as well. He is such a villain. He might as well, to quote like a Chuck Klosterman, he might as well have a black hat and a twirly, curly mustache like the old silent movies, as clearly he is meant to be a villain that's over the top. Even to the extent that you never really buy the relationship with him and Tess. And even at the end, they have to spike the ball in his face. Someone that smart would never say the words out loud that he's actually thinking, but Danny gets him to say that he would give up Tess if Danny had any information. And obviously it's on camera, and obviously Julia Roberts sees it so that we can have that last little bit. But the villain that's so over the top that he doesn't even, there's no real complexity there. He's just an ass that you definitely don't cheer for. In this case, I will not go on the epic rant I went on before, but it's got to be Arthur Smith for me. As someone who had some Falcons, so this is the head coach of the Falcons, I've gone on rants on him before, and I cut out some of the rants. Now, the part that I cut out was essentially not the worst, but it's the Nepo Baby bit. If you don't know, he comes from FedEx money. He doesn't need to work. He's got a bunch of siblings, and he's one of the few that just the chip on his shoulder. And so his idea, now, if you also don't know, over the last 3 years, they've had top 10 picks, and they've taken skill position players. So that means they took a heavily touted tight end that he has ruined and done nothing with, a receiver that he occasionally in Drake London that sometimes likes to go off but doesn't give him the attention and sometimes doesn't even give him a target, and then this year a running back who is supposed to be a generational talent who he occasionally doesn't give the ball to. And his idea is that you got to earn it. That's his justification. And that's where you see, not to make light of this because this is more serious, but you see people who are often like closeted homosexuals that come across as extremely homophobic because they see characters in others and they get super mad about it. I do not think he is a closeted homosexual. I have no idea. But in my idea here, he just sees anyone who's given anything, because he was obviously given everything, he is crazy harsh on for no particular reason. And he also just seems to be a bit of an ass. He just keeps saying, well, it's all about winning. He comes out of the gate every year, has a few good games, is like 500 after 6 games, and the last 3 years has finished 7-10 and missed the playoffs. If he is still the coach at the end of the year, then at this point, it's the Falcons head office fault. He even snaps. Now, granted, if you watch the game, the Saints were kicking the crap out of them, and the Saints needed to win to continue their chance to potentially go through. It didn't work out for them, but they were up big. Apparently, they were supposed to kneel the ball on the one. The players called an audible because they wanted this guy to get a touchdown because he hadn't gotten a touchdown all year in Williams. If you had him, you knew that. Kamara kind of took his thunder on that one, and so did Hill. But anyway, they go in, and at the end, Arthur Smith is fuming that this is disrespect. And I get it. I'd be mad if I was that coach too. But Arthur, of all the things that you have to complain about, just stop him then. Do something. Do something about it. Because you actually, every time you use Bijan Robinson in this game, I don't know if anyone was watching. You probably weren't. I was going back and forth. I was on Red Zone TV. Bijan could have taken over the game at any point in time. So, you know what, Arthur? In this particular case, normally I would side with the coach on this one, but screw you, buddy. Just get better at your life. Same with Terry Benedict. Stop being the villain. Last of the characters that I'm going to talk about, and this one's not really a character, more just a scene, so it kind of cuts between the two. It's Basher, played by Don Cheadle. Now, if you notice, he actually wasn't credited in this movie because he didn't get above the line title building, and he wanted it. He got it for 12 and 13. But there's the famous kind of scene for me. He has a quote that comes up later, but the one that I thought of when trying to relate to this season was when he has the pinch that he has to hit, that it's like the bomb without being the bomb. As he just before he touches it, he like covers up his nuts just to make sure, like, it's, you know, I guess out of habit. As soon as I was watching the movie to think about this season, I thought immediately of Tua. The reason he was great. He was the QB 9 or 10, depending on your league scoring, but, you know, top 10 QB, that's fine. But if you think about it, I mean, with his offense, he probably should have been better, but his running backs did take a lot of the touchdowns. But everyone thought the Dolphins' offense would be good. It's just anyone who hit the trigger and drafted him at the start of the year, you had to have been covering up your parts, because he was always one hit away from just getting wrecked. So thinking at the start of the year, those who took him, congratulations, you have bits of steel, but or you didn't know. But, you know, he was essentially, and still is, one concussion away from his career being over, and yet he lasted the whole season. So I know that's not really with the character of Basher. The quote that he's more famous for comes up later. But for me, I made that connection. Now we're going on to more quotes and scenes as opposed to people. This is a double down. This is a double quote, but it's at the same time. If you think of the card game at the beginning, I love just the one-off of Josh deal to your left, because Joshua Jackson keeps dealing to his right. But obviously the big one for this is Topher Grace thinking he's got it, putting down the cards and being like, ha, all red, when that's not a hand. That's obviously just a misunderstanding of what you're supposed to do. Fantasy connection, the Chiefs receivers, except for Rice, who came on at the end of the year. Wide receiver, the wide part, I mean, you sometimes, you know, there's skinny routes, there's inside slot receivers, but receivers, you should be able to catch. The receivers from the Chiefs just couldn't. They tipped the ball to the other team. They dropped the ball. They lined up offside and got penalized. They were reckless. All red, man. Understand the rules. You're there for a reason. The Basher quote I was talking about, unless you intend to do this job in Reno or in Barney Rubble, Trouble. I'm not going to even try and do the Cockney, or is it a Cockney accent? I can't remember. For this, who was in trouble? These are some of our busts and some of our early busts. Now, I will asterisk a couple because some of the busts were injury related. So say Chubb. I'm not considering him a bust, but as someone who did take him in one of my leagues, to lose your first round pick in the first quarter, that's heartbreaking, especially when I mean, I love Nick Chubb, and like, he might never be the same. That's a knee. That's just a sad note. The other asterisks I'd put on are people like maybe Jonathan Taylor. Some people did take him earlier or spend a little draft capital in terms of the auction bid on him. When he was on, he was fine. He never really took off, and he was supposed to be that steal, but you had to use a bench spot or an IR spot for most of the year because he was hurt just a ton. The last one that's more injury related, I would throw on Waddle, but he was a disappointment before. He was supposed to be the 1B to Hill's 1A. And then games when Hill went out, he very rarely took over. One game I can think of, he went off. The rest were kind of disappointing. I'd say the similar thing for Devontae Smith. A.J. Brown really did separate himself, except for the last couple of weeks when the Philly Eagles don't look great right now, and I don't really know what's going on there. But he was always that guy near the end of the year that was supposed to go on the run. In fact, I had him in a couple leagues and thought about kind of trading him for that thing, but like, no, I want to hang on to him because he should make a run like he has in previous years. He just didn't. So that's not so much bust, but disappointment. The other people I'm going to mention, I'm going to say straight up bust. The first two that come to mind, Eckler and Pollard. If you took them, you probably took them in the first or early second rounds as running backs. When I mentioned the people who took McCaffrey and how happy they were, that's in comparison to these two guys. Just brutal. The other one I'd probably throw out at running back, maybe Sanders. He was a top 4, top 5 pick, if you remember, for most people, and really just didn't do anything, but neither did the Panthers, so Akers has to be another one. If you looked in most of our leagues, he was taken with a top 4, top 5 pick. He did next to nothing. I mean, essentially, he did nothing and then got cut. And at receivers, I think Kupp is an interesting one. I could put him on the injury, but even when he was in, he didn't look himself. But you always had to put him in thinking that he was going to be himself. meh. Ridley is definitely probably top of my list on this one. Just massively disappointment. I thought he was going to have a breakout year. Most of the analytics people thought Jacksonville was the analytics darlings. They loved Trevor Lawrence, who is going to come up in a minute. But he just never really, he had a couple weeks, but that was pretty much it. I'd even put Terry McLaurin in this as well, but I don't really blame him. I mean, he can't throw himself the ball. Speaking of throwing the ball, I'd say I'd throw in Herbert as your quarterback pick here. He was on most boards after, Hurts and Allen and Mahomes, and he was kind of in that Lamar tier. Do you take Lamar Jackson or Herbert? And he just was not doing it for you this year. And I'd throw in one running back just because it's sad because I think he's actually still really talented, but Barkley, Saquon, no bueno. So these to me were my list of busts. I might have missed someone. If I did, leave them in the comments. Now, I've worked in schools enough to know that I can't say the word suicide without actually, saying some kind of a trigger bit. I am not trying to make light of it, but the quote is the quote, and it's one of my favorite quotes in the movie. Are you scared? The return from Matt Damon's character. Are you suicidal? Pitt drops only in the morning. I love that line. Especially, I feel like I was more akin to it when I was running a bar. But these are the guys that came close to getting it and actually won you a couple weeks, but then just overall made you so frustrated you were tearing your hair out. So effectively, they weren't straight up busts because they had weeks where they probably won it for you. But when it came down to it, just overall, they weren't worth the hassle. At quarterback, I'd mentioned before, Trevor Lawrence has to be there. He had that little stretch in the middle. You're like, he's finally there. He's arrived. But when he was off, he was just off. And as someone who had him in a bunch of leagues, it sucked because he was good enough that you always thought you had to play him. Speaking of which, at wide receiver, you got to put Diggs and Adams here. Now, I know Adams went off recently. And then if you got to the finals with him, you were happy because he had a great final. But he had weeks where he literally had no target or one target. Right. And so that's so frustrating. Diggs was in the same boat. In an offense that should score all the time, when you see the Bills go down and drive and score a touchdown, it looks so easy for them that you're like, just do that all the time, but they don't. So I put him on the frustrating bit. For running back, I mentioned Bijan, not his fault, but he's not getting the carries, but he would sometimes give you enough that you had to put him in there, but he'd have weeks where he just got ghosted. I'd put Cook in the same bit. Same with the Bills. Been there. Sometimes when you have a running quarterback, they steal your touchdowns. So again, he had a couple weeks where he definitely hit it, which made you put him in, which made you disappointed. You get it. And I'd say at tight end, Goddard. He was drafted in as a top 5 tight end, and he had a few weeks that made you justify why you'd want him in. But his first half of the season, it's like they forgot about him. Then he got hurt. He had a resurgence, but overall, just not worth it. Brad Pitt has and this is more to do with the podcast and the article, he has a way about him that you can just forgive character traits. If you think of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, I mean, his character probably killed someone, and we're like, yeah, but it's Brad Pitt. He took his shirt off and he looks cool. For this, the one sketchy line he just throws out, and I know it's supposed to be a passing joke, but when they talk about the colleague of theirs that died, he said, did you send flowers? His reply was, dated his wife for a while. It's pretty sketchy to go and pick up on your friend's, widow. But we let it go because it's Brad Pitt. So I think just everyone kind of looks the other way. They're likable. And I think for this one, this might be just doubling down on something I'd already said, but I got to go with Mahomes. The Netflix series, they were so pumped up for that it kind of makes sense why they got it all together. And this year, this might age horrible. They have the Dolphins in the first round of the playoffs. The Dolphins are playing brutal. They're at home. They could pump them. They could catch, I think they're the 3 seats. I think it's put in the 2. I mean, the Bills choke if the Bills get by this. There's a way that they actually make it back to the AFC final or potentially the Super Bowl if they just put it together, and then I look like a jerk store. But he just didn't look, it's like he was frustrated and you could tell by his outburst by the end. But we kind of just let it go. We're like, yeah, he whined and complained, but it's Mahomes. He's likable. Look at it. Thought those two went together. One of my favorite scenes in the movie, and I say that a ton because there's a lot of scenes that I love in this, but I'm going to talk about the scene in a little bit, but this is a quote that I thought was more indicative. It's the back and forth between George Clooney and Julia Roberts. So Tess and Danny, exes, I think they did sign the papers, at the bar. Well lit. Soderbergh's perfect at this. If you love this at all and you've seen, I think Clooney and Lopez in an earlier movie a few years before. But The line, does he make you laugh? And the immediate reply, well, he doesn't make me cry. In this case, goes to Mike Evans. He was so unsexy, and everyone just assumes, it's just 1,000 yards, but he can't just keep doing it. And look at his quarterback, it's Baker. But I'm avoiding the fact that she's actually talking about Terry Benedict, a horrible person, but just saying this idea, you never get out, like, you draft Mike Evans, no one's going, oh, epic pick, well done. But how the hell are you sad about that pick this year? He's a top 6, top 7 receiver in most scoring formats, number 5 in most of the ones that we do. He could honestly have been a league winner, but just so unsexy. But again, he maybe he doesn't make you laugh, but he sure as crap does not make you cry. Speaking of a relationship in terms of screwing people over, there's a line once Brad Pitt discovers that Tess is involved, and he says he's threatening to walk off the job. And he says, tell me this is not about screwing the guy that's screwing your wife. For this, and this is not my theory, the new coach theory, if you look when a coach gets fired in the middle of the year, you can kind of tell if people rally or not. To an extent, you see this with Bill Belichick. All these rumors was he's out the door this year, and he might, as of right now, there was no news. But the players rallied around him. They actually won some games they shouldn't have because they could have gotten the second pick. I think they're in line, the Patriots, for 3, and no one's crying because it's the freaking Patriots. And they might keep him. But other coaches, if their players rally, then you get a sense that maybe the players actually wanted it. Wanted the move is what I'm going for in this one. So the opposite of the Belichick. So the player leaves and it's just like, all right, let's screw this guy over because he's been screwing us. So let's have a run. You saw this in the Chargers and you saw this in the Raiders. Panthers to an extent, not really, but they did lose by 3 to Tampa Bay, and it was actually a really good game. So when Josh McDaniels was gone from the Raiders, they came back with a power punch game the next game. When Wright was out for the Panthers, like I said, they put up a big fight. And when Staley went out with the Chargers, the team responded as if to say, thank you for getting rid of this guy. So the aforementioned scene, and you could put the whole scene with Tess and Danny at the bar going back and forth. A couple of the quotes that I told you I'd write when she talks about, he said he got the divorce papers his last day in, or when Clooney sits down and orders a whiskey. I've actually tried to pull that off several times. Usually you get people really confused about what you're asking for. For me, this scene is so great because it's probably the best chemistry in the whole movie. There's a Brad Pitt, George Clooney comparison that I'm going to get to in the next one. But in this case, I was looking for who had the best chemistry this year. And I think one of the problems with the injuries to the quarterbacks this year is we actually didn't see a lot of offensive chemistry. When the quarterback's gone, it really does, put kind of a hitch. And you could think, well, there's another team I'm going to mention later on that could have qualified, but they just never really seemed to flow. So the 2 people I thought that actually did show this year, and if you took them, you know what I'm talking about, in Dallas, which I would not have put at the beginning of the season as the team with good chemistry, might not be the whole offense, but Dax and CeeDee Lamb. Dax being quarterback 4 in most formats, CeeDee as the number 1, and just sparks flew when they're on the field at the same time. If you actually looked, even broken plays, set plays, they kind of had it all down together. The 2 of them are on the same page. Their defense is good enough to make a lot of plays. I honestly think if Dallas is going to be a sneaky team now as a number 2, how can they be sneaky? But they've been riding the coattails of the Eagles all year. They just recently passed them. If they're going to go ahead and win anything big, it's the 2 of them that are going to do it, and it's got to be because of the chemistry. So when I was thinking of the chemistry bit, I wanted to highlight them, but there's 2 offenses that were just the coolest offenses to have. And if you had any of the players involved, you were happy most weeks. And to this, I go to the coolest scene and probably my favorite overall scene. It's between Danny and Rusty. Rusty's at the bar. They're watching the boxing highlights, and it's the one-way scene. Danny's like, 10 ought to do it, don't you think? No response. You think we need one more? You think we need one more? All right, we'll get one more. I think it's just a cool scene, and just because it kind of just flows naturally. You get the idea, you get the chemistry, you get it. So for this, I took one offense in each conference that I thought were just, if you had anyone as a part of it, more often than not, you were happy. But like I said, maybe not chemistry between 2 people. You get it. Miami Dolphins in the AFC, 49ers in the NFC. Whether you had Debo or Ayuk, if they were healthy, obviously we talked about McCaffrey, Kittle, they could score from all ends. Purdy was obviously someone I'd mentioned before. And same with the Dolphins, except for Waddle, that kind of bit. Either running back, how many times can you actually appease 2 running backs throughout an entire year? And obviously you got the receiving core. I thought those 2 offenses, when you had a piece of them, you were often pretty happy. They were some of the coolest offenses of the year. All right, we're coming down to the end, and here's kind of the last little bit. The longest quote, I will try not just to read directly, but I want to make sure I get it right. This is Pitt to Damon's character when Damon has to pinch hit for Clooney because the things that were going on. Don't use 7 words when 4 will do. Don't shift your weight. Look always at your mark, but don't stare. Be specific, but not memorable. Be funny, but don't make him laugh. He's got to like you and then forget you the moment you've left his side. And for God's sakes, whatever you do, don't, under any circumstances, then shiny things. He gets distracted. For that one, anyone who's still waiting for wisdom from my videos, I did have random tidbits of knowledge, probably not enough to get you to want to go. So hopefully I was entertaining, and then you forgot about me the second you turned off the channel and you just did your own thing. I know some people said they appreciated some of my NFL breakdown, and hopefully it was helpful. But obviously, if you want to win, you got to go further than just me and look at other people. But hey, I appreciate it for everyone who liked, left comments, subscribed. Thanks, folks. I really do appreciate it. Last one, and this is a cop-out. If you remember the movie, then you remember the last scene. The fountain, the music, it's chill. Again, except for Clooney, who's getting pretend roughed up. This is when the music hits. You're all smiles. You know you did it perfectly. Only one person per league gets this, and this is to the league winners. Congratulations. If you hit it, then obviously no matter what happened, all the bumps along the way, you've got smiles, and you know it was a job well done. So congrats. And with that, that's the end of my recaps for this year. Now, we can talk about future years. Obviously, for each league, I'll be putting out polls. And like I said, if you're interested in some of the stuff I mentioned, I put all the links below in terms of the site that I have that I write some things, or my podcast link if you yearn for my voice because you've heard it weekly for so long, well, I would not want to deprive you of that. So there it is. Thanks again for an awesome year. Thanks for indulging me by listening and following along. And already, can't wait till next season.